Hey everybody, welcome to our weekly speaker series Saving Life on Earth webinar. I'm Tiara Curry. I'm a senior scientist in our Saving Life on Earth campaign, and I'm grateful that you're here this evening. We're going to take a deep dive with some of our staff into some of their success stories and strategies. I'm grateful that we've had this series of webinars during the pandemic so that you can get to know our staff better and so that we can interact with you all a little bit on Slack and in the emails that you send. Tonight, we're only going to talk about good news. The poet Wendell Berry said, "Be joyful though you've considered all the facts." And we're not trying to downplay the fires or the hurricanes or the racial injustice or the pandemic. All of those things are on our minds. But we want to share with you some success stories and strategies in this long haul fight for a just, livable planet. Yes, much work remains to be done, but a lot of great work is being done, including by you guys at home joining us on this webinar. You may have seen that the UN Global Biodiversity Outlook came out last week, and mostly it was bad news, but there was one positive note. They reported that 44% of vital biodiverse areas are now under protection as compared to only 29% 20 years ago. So that's a little bit of progress. And also a paper came out detailing recent conservation efforts that have saved 48 species of birds and mammals that they think would have gone extinct if people hadn't taken action to save them. And they said that the extinction rate for birds and mammals since 1993 would have been 4 times higher without the work of people to help. So we know that environmental battles are long and difficult, and sometimes it's really hard to see that we can win. Sometimes it's litigation, sometimes it's decades of fighting, sometimes it's public pressure that leads to success. The victories happen on many levels: local, regional, national, international. Tonight, we're going to talk with 2 of our awesome people in state programs about some of their recent wins, and you're going to love them because I love them. So I'm excited that we get to highlight their work tonight. We've disabled chat because that can be really distracting. We'll be on Slack tomorrow from noon to 1 Pacific to chat with you if you want to continue the conversation. If you don't know what Slack is or how to join, you'll get an email right after this webinar with instructions. And it'll also have an action alert with a big proactive ask. Scientists say that we need to protect half the Earth for all the other species by 2050 to keep the planet livable, and 30% by 2030. So we're going to send you an action alert asking you to contact your representatives and ask them to support the 30 by 30 resolution that would set aside 30% of the US's wildlife habitat by 2030. So again, thanks for being here, and I'm going to introduce you to Patrick and Perrin. Patrick, take it away.
Hi everybody, my name is Patrick Donnelly. I'm Nevada State Director for the center. I live just outside Las Vegas in the desert, and feel very honored to be joining you tonight. I've been at the center for about 4 years and been fighting for desert conservation for, I guess this is my 17th year in the field. Really passionate about saving species, especially here in Nevada. Our many endemic species that live nowhere else on Earth, but right here in Nevada. We have many dozens of fish, plants, small mammals, other species that are endemic to 1 or just a handful of sites. Really an exciting place for the front lines of fighting the extinction crisis and preserving biodiversity. So happy to be here tonight and looking forward to discussing some of our wins with you.
And I am Perrin de Jong. I'm the North Carolina staff attorney here in the Asheville, North Carolina office, right here in the western North Carolina mountains in the heart of the Southern Appalachian range in the Blue Ridge Mountains, which is also pretty central to the Southeastern and Appalachian aquatic biodiversity bonanza that we have going on here in the Southeast and in Southern Appalachia and Central Appalachia. We'll be getting into a lot of those details soon. And as you can see, there are a lot of different kinds of species we advocate for here out of the North Carolina office, and I'm excited to tell you more about that later in the presentation. Thanks, Tiara.
So the slide you're looking at that Perrin used as his intro slide is this beautiful banner that the artist Roger Pete made of some of the species that we work on. Roger does our endangered species mural project, but we haven't been able to do that with the coronavirus shutdown, but we're looking forward to getting that going again. So I want to take a minute and just give you a very brief overview of some big center-wide wins that we've had, many of these with allies I'm only going to tell you a little bit about them, but I will tell you that we're launching a new webpage that will have more details on these, and it's going to be called Good News Roundup, and it's almost ready, so we'll be able to share it with you soon. But some of these species, the whooping crane, we helped score a national legal victory that stopped the rubber stamping of permits for stream crossings for pipelines that halted Keystone XL and temporarily halted all other stream crossings. So that was a very big win. We kept grizzly bears protected around Yellowstone National Park. We got a moratorium on new oil and gas leasing in greater sage-grouse habitat of 1 million acres. And we stopped the rubber stamping of permits for coal mining and endangered species habitat that had been happening since 1996. I've been working on this for 13 years. This is the Kentucky arrow darter. In Appalachia, coal companies can blow up mountains and push the waste directly into streams, and they got a free pass under the Endangered Species Act. And this year that pass was taken away. So I'm very excited about that particular bit of good news. These cute little critters, that's the Humboldt martin and the Pacific fisher. The Humboldt martin got protection under the Endangered Species Act this year after a decade of advocating for it. The fisher, we've been advocating for ESA protection for 20 years with our allies, and fisher in the southern Sierra Nevada mountains finally got that protection this year. We're still working on the rest of the Pacific fisher range. And the black pine snake got a large critical habitat designation that will save a lot of beautiful longleaf pine habitat in the southeast. Other species also got critical habitat protection. This is the Sonoyta mud turtle in Arizona and the elfin woods warbler in Puerto Rico. The leatherback sea turtle and mountain lion got candidate protection under the California Endangered Species Act. These are some of the species that our international team works on. All of these species got some trade restrictions under the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Flora and Fauna this year. This is the black teatfish sea cucumber, the giraffe, and the pancake and star tortoises. We had some other really big wins this year. We've been fighting this mine, this open pit copper mine outside Tucson for more than a decade. And we stopped it this year and protected habitat for jaguar and other species. We stopped timber sales in the habitat of lynx in several states. And we helped end wildlife killing contests in a handful of states this year. That was where people just went out senselessly and shot as many coyotes or whatever species as they could in a day, and we helped bring an end to those. So that's just some of the good news. Oops, I keep advancing the screen. Sorry, you guys. Every week I feel like I have to tell you how bad I am at tech. That's some of our national good news, and now I'm going to hand it to Patrick, and he can tell you about some of his very big, exciting wins in Nevada.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm going to focus on two of our campaigns this evening, in the Ruby Mountains and the Las Vegas pipeline. We've had assorted wins, but I kind of wanted to do a deep dive for you all about what we've been doing for these campaigns. So starting off with the Ruby Mountains, we can go back to the previous slide, please. The Ruby Mountains are a 11,000-foot mountain range in northeastern Nevada. They are home to greater sage-grouse, they're home to mule deer, home to Lahontan cutthroat trout, the threatened state fish of Nevada. They are beloved by sportsmen, they are beloved by wildlife watchers, they are beloved by long-distance hikers, the Ruby Crest Trails, a National Scenic Trail. It is really Nevada's crown jewel, one of the most special places in the state. And next slide, please. Sure enough, you know, the Trump administration, with their drill anywhere philosophy, ended up proposing leasing 54,000 acres mostly on top of the Ruby Mountains. You can see the lease parcels here. The green north-south strip is the crest of the Rubies, and that's Forest Service land. The red parcels are the proposed lease parcels. And much of that area was proposed wilderness. It's roadless, completely wild country. It's priority habitat for the greater sage-grouse. It is a major mule deer migratory corridor right through those lease parcels. In short, if you're going to pick somewhere in Nevada to lease oil and gas, this may be the worst place in the state. And the outcry was swift and furious. We engaged partners from all over the conservation spectrum and well beyond the conservation community as well. This is ancestral land for the Western Shoshone, the Tamok band of the Western Shoshone. And the Tomoke band played a very important role in pushing back against this awful proposal. As well, we actually had support from state agencies, believe it or not. The state of Nevada is notoriously friendly to the mining industry, but we are not necessarily beholden to the oil industry. There's very little oil in the state. And in particular, the State Department of Wildlife became very concerned about this because this is the biggest, best mule deer herd in the state that crosses right over those parcels. Next slide, please. So in reflection of that coalition, you can see this full page ad we took out in the Elko Daily Free Press. There were a number of groups whose logos you can see at the bottom of this ad. It's a little small, but you can trust us that it's a large coalition of groups representing a really wide variety of interests. You know, half of those groups on that poster there fight with each other all the time. You know, there are hunting groups and there's the Center for Biological Diversity right next to our logos are right next to each other. And that was really the key to winning this battle, was the unity across the spectrum, across the aisle. Every Nevadan got together and said, this is a terrible idea. And ultimately, you know, that's what convinced our senator, Senator Cortez Masto, to intervene. She introduced the Ruby Mountains Protection Act to permanently ban oil leasing in the Rubies. That bill is not passed yet, but it is sitting in the Senate waiting for Mitch McConnell to take action. That bill was such a catalyst that ultimately the Forest Service denied the leasing. This is an extremely rare thing for the Forest Service to go through a process to permit this and then at the end say, nope, we're not going to lease these lands. It was pretty surprising, really. We thought we'd be in court for the next decade. And that did not happen. The leases were denied and we won in the Rubies. It was thrilling. It was one of the more thrilling moments in my career because this was a short campaign. This was a campaign that lasted 2 years, less than 2 years, from the time the leases were proposed till the time we killed them. And so that's interesting because I think a lot of what Tiara just showed us, a lot of what we might be talking about tonight are long-term campaigns, but sometimes campaigns can be short and furious. And this one certainly was because the entire state was riled up about it. So pretty exciting. Next slide, please. So the second project I want to tell you about is one of those long-term projects. It's the Las Vegas water grab pipeline. There has long been a proposal to pipe water from eastern Nevada, groundwater resources, through a 300-mile-long pipeline to be built by the Southern Nevada Water Authority, which would terminate in Las Vegas, providing groundwater to Las Vegas water users to fill swimming pools and water golf courses. And this was seen as truly an existential threat to the groundwater-dependent ecosystems of eastern Nevada. Next slide, please. You can see a map here of the Great Basin as a whole, and the proposed pipeline was the red line there, which would have gone from Snake Valley and Spring Valley in eastern Nevada down to Las Vegas. And this would have impacted a tremendous amount of wildlife, from endemic fishes like the Moapa dace or the Pahrump poolfish, to your whole suite of Great Basin wildlife that just exist everywhere. Badgers, jackrabbits, pronghorn antelope, mule deer, the species that are somewhat common, but ultimately by dewatering the landscape would have been in peril. And the key to success here was endless pressure, endlessly applied. The Great Basin Water Network, one of our close allies, formed about 15 years ago from a coalition of residents and tribes and other interests in eastern Nevada. They coalesced around the Great Basin Water Network. Again, the unlikely allies, the Center for Biological Diversity and the cattle ranchers and the Nevada Farm Bureau, working together because ultimately we all agreed that water is better off in eastern Nevada than it is in a swimming pool in Las Vegas. Next slide, please. So there was 30 years of history on this campaign. The applications for this pipeline were filed in 1989. Indeed, the activist you see here in this photo, Kyle, who's the executive director of the Water Network, was barely born when the pipeline fight started. And yet it really came to a denouement in the past year. We hauled the big bucket out to the legislative building and parked it on the steps of the legislative building, raised a huge stink, a hue and a cry about about this pipeline at the legislature. Frankly, the governor was none too happy that we hijacked the legislature with our bucket. Ultimately, the legislation we were fighting, which would have enabled the pipeline, died within 24 hours of our bucket press release. And a few months later, the Southern Nevada Water Authority began putting the wheels in motion to terminate the pipeline altogether. That came to a final conclusion on May 21st. The pipeline died after a 30-year struggle. Just unbelievable that there was generations of conservationists and environmentalists who this fight was handed down to generation to generation. I felt really honored to spend the past 4 years of my life fighting this pipeline, inheriting that fight from my predecessor here at the center, Rob Maraca. And really killing that pipeline, is going to resonate through generations of water politics here in Nevada, and was a thrilling victory. So, thank you. I'll pass it on to Perrin now.
Just fantastic, Patrick. Wow, those wins are really the product of moving heaven and earth, and it's a testament to the quality of the work you're doing out there. Super inspiring. Well, I want to bring you across the Rockies, across the Great Basin, across the Mississippi River, and all the way east to the East Coast here in North Carolina, where we have a lot of stuff going on. Now, I want to talk about the red wolf and an achievement we won this year for the red wolf. This is a species that our members really, really care about, as do I. It's a species, as many of you know, that's only found in the wild in eastern North Carolina, in a 5-county area in eastern North Carolina. And those of you who have followed the saga, the ongoing saga of the red wolf since the reintroductions began in the 1980s here in North Carolina, it will sound familiar to you that over 5 years ago, Fish and Wildlife Service came under a tremendous amount of local pressure from people who weren't happy about having the wolves around, and pressure from the state's Wildlife Resources Commission to give up on the recovery program for this magnificent species, apex predator. And well, they caved. And for 5 years, 5 long agonizing years, the Fish and Wildlife Service did absolutely nothing to promote the recovery of this species. And it was just agonizing as the individuals were being killed, and terrible things were happening, and they weren't trying to build up the population and replenish the population with reintroductions all that time. And there was this, there's a massive suite of organizations. It's not just the Center for Biological Diversity that advocates for the red wolf out in eastern North Carolina, but nothing worked. Nothing worked, no matter what anybody did. And one day we decided we were just tired of trying to play nice, and we sued the Fish and Wildlife Service to force them to issue a new recovery plan, a legally enforceable new recovery plan that would ensure the survival and recovery of this species in the wild. And it was fascinating what happened. 3 weeks to the day after we filed that lawsuit to force them to establish this new recovery plan, which was years overdue already by law, they announced that they were resuming reintroductions of red wolves, and they were going to start matchmaking in the wild again, trying to get breeding pairs going again in the wild population. And it was just a fascinating study in the dynamics of how coalition movement work can happen and can work synergistically, and how somebody who's willing to file a lawsuit might complement someone who's negotiating on the inside. But we really triggered that single-handedly ourselves, and that was just a very gratifying thing to see happen. There's a lot more that needs to be done, but we've finally gotten to square one with resuming recovery efforts for the red wolves. So yay, red wolves. Another thing I want to tell you about, the second slide, please, is there's a fracked gas pipeline called the Mountain Valley Pipeline Southgate spur that was going to extend from the proposed southern end of the Mountain Valley Pipeline, the bigger Mountain Valley Pipeline. in southern Virginia and into central North Carolina in the Piedmont, running over the habitat of the endangered Roanoke log perch, the northern long-eared bat, the Atlantic pigtoe, freshwater mussel. You can see all those species here. These are all imperiled species or proposed listed species under the Endangered Species Act. Terrible idea. And we were fortunate enough to successfully challenge what's called the 401 certification. It's basically a water permit. Every state that will be impacted by a big project like this has to sign off and say that the water impacts of the project will not degrade the water resources of the state under the Clean Water Act. Luckily enough for us, we had a receptive administration here in North Carolina, and we fed them the ammunition they needed to deny the water permit. Without this water permit, the denial for which was announced this summer by the state of North Carolina, Mountain Valley cannot build this fracked gas pipeline, bringing fracked gas from these areas in West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Ohio, down south into our region to increase the profitability of the fracking industry and incentivize more fracking. So that's a huge win for a bunch of species that were imperiled by that project. And we are super happy about that. We're sure the fight's not over, but that's a major roadblock, and we're fighting on other fronts to make sure they can't get it restarted as well. Next slide, please. So the greatest joy in my job is working with a certain person in the Center for Biological Diversity who will go unnamed here, named Tierra Curry, on freshwater biodiversity protection, protecting and restoring freshwater biodiversity. Tierra got this work in the Southeast started 13 years ago when she started at the center. And I've had the great joy of sort of picking up the torch when I started 3 years ago and continuing this work on and carrying some of these cases to successful fruition. So we have successfully, since I came on board, we have successfully gotten the Carolina Mad Tom, that winsome little catfish you see in the upper left-hand corner there of the slide, proposed listed as endangered under the Endangered Species Act. And the Neuse River water dog in the bottom right-hand corner is being listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. Incredible little aquatic salamander with those flame-like gills, extensions you see there. Super exciting. Both of those are endemic species in North Carolina. They only exist in North Carolina, and so we're super proud to be protecting those and making sure that they have a future too. So in addition to the new listings, we've also succeeded in getting 1,800 stream miles of new critical habitat protected in North Carolina, Virginia, Kentucky, West Virginia, and Maryland. And 1,229 miles of those critical habitat areas are here in North Carolina. This critical habitat will go towards protecting the Carolina Mad Tom, the Neuse River water dog, the Guyandotte River crayfish, which only exists in 2 creeks in West Virginia now because it's so threatened by coal mining in southern West Virginia. Also the big sandy crayfish across Kentucky, West Virginia, and Virginia, also very much under threat by coal mining there. And the yellow lance across North Carolina, Virginia, and Maryland, freshwater mussel that's very much in need of protection across the Southeast. So we are very excited to be promoting the protection of these species. And what is listing and critical habitat protection get you, or get a species? Well, the answer is it adds another tool to our toolbox for advocates like the center to use to make sure that new projects don't run over these species and drive them over the extinction cliff. And also we can use those same tools to ensure that their ranges are being expanded and that their habitat is being not only protected, but also restored. So there's a brighter future for these species so long as there are advocates and activists out there who are willing to use these tools for them. So on the same note, next slide, please. We have also brought about, really excited to have brought about relief for imperiled aquatic species in North Carolina. We have secured $45 million. The center, in a case that included other groups like Sound Rivers, Clean Air Carolina, Southern Environmental Law Center, but really solely due to the work of the center, we secured $45 million in funding for habitat protection, habitat restoration, propagation of imperiled species, reintroduction of imperiled species into the wild, and research for promoting the conservation of North Carolina imperiled aquatic species like the dwarf wedge mussel in the bottom right-hand corner, the yellow lance, which you saw on the last slide, the Atlantic pigtoe sitting there next to the dwarf wedge mussel, another freshwater mussel. Neuse River water dog and Clean Carolina mad tom are going to sound familiar to you at this point. And also the magnificent ram's horn, which is endemic to North Carolina. That's that beautiful snail there in the center of the slide, which really needs a lot of help. It's no longer found in the wild and is only in captivity. So it really needs new habitat and protection of new habitat. In addition to that, strictly due to the center's work, we won 47,000 stream feet of aquatic habitat protection and restoration through new conservation easements that are being set up through the state government for all of these species I just mentioned in imperiled watersheds, but watersheds that still harbor these sensitive aquatic species across the state. So this is a huge boon for North Carolina, and I'm really proud to have been a part of bringing these new benefits to this state. And thanks to the help of our partner groups in being a part of that effort as well. But that's what we contributed to that effort. So last slide, we've got a major campaign going to end the burning of coal at UNC Chapel Hill's campus. UNC Chapel Hill is the last institution of higher learning in the state of North Carolina that still burns coal on campus. We're working to bring that to an end on behalf of the big sandy crayfish, which I mentioned we've won both listing for under the Endangered Species Act and critical habitat for in the intervening years since Tierra got started working on that. And it turns out UNC Chapel Hill gets its coal in part from a watershed where the big sandy crayfish lives and where it has proposed critical habitat now, but they're mining upstream from where these big sandy crayfish are trying to hang on to survival. So it's very important for the crayfish that we end this coal use. And we've built a very, very diverse campaign around. We've got litigation for clean air violations that they've got, Clean Air Act violations that we are litigating right now as we speak very heavily and intensely. We've got all kinds of organizing going on campus with the students and the community members as well in town with our organizers. We've also got a lot of permit advocacy. We've been fighting the renewal of their permit. We've gone to EPA to reform the North Carolina's air regulatory process so that it makes it harder for UNC to keep burning coal and harming the surrounding community with air pollution, which is affecting so many people like myself who grew up in Chapel Hill with a life-threatening case of asthma and plenty of other chronic respiratory conditions, probably because of this very coal plant. And the good news is that because of the pressure that we have been putting on UNC for 3 years now and have kept on UNC, along with some other groups and other activists who are in town, they're working on this issue, there has been a 43% documented reduction in the use of coal in UNC Chapel Hill's coal plant since we started this pressure campaign. And it appears that that amount of coal continues to go down over time. So,
and that is awesome. When I'm like depressed and need to be cheered up, I call it Patrick or Perrin. And I'll tell you something funny about Patrick. So I'm a big time morning person. I'm usually up by 6, I'm ready to go. And we were all at program retreat one time and I get up at 5:45 to check the Federal Register and step out, and Patrick's already out there. He's already got coffee. He's already at work and he's like, hey, let's go get some more coffee. So anyway, Patrick, don't mean to embarrass you, but tell us about some of your strategies for success. You had 2 really huge wins this year. Tell us what keeps you going.
Yeah, thank you. I think there's a couple of threads we can pull from these wins and other wins. I think first, creative approaches and interventions. So an example of that might be depositing a 15-foot tall bucket on the steps of the legislative building. That's kind of an outside the box thing. I think, you know, most of the lobbyists of the legislature were not doing such things, but it made a big impact. I think another example is something we just did a couple weeks ago, which has not yet resulted in a victory, but is a creative intervention. We filed an SEC complaint against a mining company. That's a Security and Exchange Commission. We allege they were misleading investors through some of their misleading statements. It's highly unusual for an environmental group to file an SEC complaint about a mining company. But again, it's sort of an example of kind of one of those creative approaches that can sometimes help, I think, in outside the box. You cannot overstate the importance of the Freedom of Information Act, FOIA, and state public records requests. A good FOIA can help turn the tide on an issue. You know, these laws are intended to put sunshine on the government, to open their records, which are public records, to the public. And on the rubies is a good example. You know, we certainly mounted a very robust campaign on the rubies. But the really turning point on the rubies came after I did a Freedom of Information Act request, and I uncovered what was supposed to be their final decision, which was to allow leasing. So this was, oh gosh, it must have been fall of 2018. And I did this big FOIA. I got a bunch of files back, and buried in the middle of it was a draft final decision to allow drilling. And, you know, we publicized that. We put it out to the media. We sent it to Senator Cortez Masto. And ultimately, that's what turned the tide. She hauled the Forest Service in front of her committee, the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, and grilled the Forest Service chief about this for about 10 minutes. It was very uncomfortable for that person. And then not 2 weeks later, she introduced the Ruby Mountains Protection Act. So that FOIA was a key turning point on our Ruby Mountains campaign. Next, never underestimate the value of a good photograph for conservation purposes. And this is especially important dealing with obscure species and obscure landscapes, places and critters no one's ever heard of, many people are probably never going to see. And yet there's beauty. There's beauty in some of these landscapes, some of these species that are the least among us. And I think a good photographs, you know, the Ruby Mountains, you saw my photographs earlier of the rubies. I went out there at sunset when I first heard about this issue. I just said, I got to get up there and take some photos. Got a couple really good ones, and you know, they end up in the newspaper. They end up on the center's promotional materials and on our action alerts. I think another example is the Dixie Valley toad. This is a very obscure toad we're fighting for in a single marsh in Dixie Valley, Nevada. Well, no one had ever taken a good picture of the Dixie Valley toad before. It had been seen by a handful of agency biologists, and that's it. So I went out there, again, at sunrise. You got to get the good lighting, and got some great photos of the Dixie Valley toad, and that ended up in the National USA Today paper. And all of a sudden, people were talking about the Dixie Valley toad. There's a lot of reasons to that, but a compelling photograph, compelling imagery really goes a long way toward making these obscure places and obscure species tangible to folks like you all, the folks watching this webinar, who are our important supporters and members. Because ultimately, we want you all to understand why you support us and why we're fighting for what we fight for. Coalitions are of critical importance to our campaigns. You noticed both of the issues I referred to were one, at least on the basis of coalitions, and in particular the unlikely allies, strange bedfellows as we call it, where it's us and the hunting community, or us and the farming community. You know, we have major issues with some hunting and with, you know, bovine agriculture. And yet when we have those similar interests, bridging those divides can really lead to unexpected and advantageous outcomes. I also think it's important to keep context in mind on coalitions. You know, the center is who the center is. We sue the bad guys. We say the things everyone else is afraid to say. We hold the powerful accountable. Not every group is willing to do that. And so I think part of this coalition dynamic is figuring out where our organization, where the cutting edge of the environmental movement belongs in those coalitions. And I think it's trying to leverage those assets, leverage our courage, our ability to, again, say the unpopular things that no one else wants to hear, hold powerful people accountable, and doing so in a way that, you know, the hunting group or the kind of mainstream environmental group can do their thing, and it's complementary to doing our thing on the more cutting edge. So I think that's an important factor. Massive public outcry is really important, and that's where you all come in, our members and supporters. You know, you may think, oh, here's another action alert from the center. I just click, 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 and all right. You know, but when an act like Tiara or myself or Perrin or any of our dozens of other activists all of a sudden have thousands of signatures in their hand on an issue, that is compelling. In and of itself, it might not be, but when we're able to use that as a tool, when we're able to go to policymakers, 18,000 people commented opposed to oil drilling in the Ruby Mountains. Those are your voters, those are your constituents, and they feel strongly about this. That is just totally invaluable for advancing our agenda. So that massive public outcry and that clicktivism, we call it, really does make a difference in campaigns. And finally, I'll just refer to the old maxim. This was a quote from Brock Evans, a longtime environmentalist, who said, we need to do endless pressure, endlessly applied. That's how we win. And that means never letting up, never stopping. That means taking a win, an incremental victory on an issue, and fighting back the next day for your next win, because the bad guys aren't letting up. And the bad guys have powerful interests and lots of money lined up behind them. With us, we have our activism, we have our passion, we have our science, we have our incredible support team, but we can't let up. And you need to literally, the day you get an incremental win on an issue, you need to immediately start plotting your next win. And so ultimately, those incremental victories end up preserving landscapes, saving species, and stopping the extinction crisis. So those are some of my winning strategies I wanted to share with you.
Thanks, Patrick. We also have our awesome members and supporters, and it really means a lot when we hear from you guys, when you take the action alerts, and when you take the time to tell us that you too care about the frogs and snails and toads and freshwater mussels. Perrin, tell us about some of your strategies for success.
Yeah, if you could flip the slide. There you go. So I have a lot of, I concur with Patrick in a lot of ways. But I think I have a slightly different spin on some of these ideas. I saw one of the questions in the box there was what we're doing that other folks are not doing. And I think that that's been a real key to the success that our office has enjoyed here in North Carolina since we got started 3 years ago, was looking for fights that were not cause celebs. So pick obscure fights and try new tricks. A lot of the times, the most famous fights are kind of overstaffed in a lot of ways. And so you've got people turning over every rock already. If you pick a fight that's not very popular, that hasn't been taken up for whatever reason, you might find that it's pretty easy to find a good tactic to challenge a terrible project with, because nobody else has gone there to turn over the rocks and figure out where the weak spots are in it. So picking obscure fights can lead to quicker and more effective campaigns, quick wins and more effective campaign tactics. Trying new tricks is a big part of it. And connected to that idea is being willing to fight with tactics that nobody else wants to use. At the time, so the Red Wolf reintroductions, that's a great example of that. Nobody else at that time was interested in suing over the recovery plan, and because other groups were engaged in negotiation with the agency at that time. And we said, you know what, we're just gonna throw the book at them. and let's see if we can shake something loose here. And sure enough, it was the final straw that finally broke through the logjam on reintroductions for red wolves, at least in my opinion. So death by 1,000 cuts is the third one. And this is something that my colleagues and I talk about a good bit. Sounds sort of grotesque, but the idea is that you attack them from every direction simultaneously and keep piling on new tactics, new pressure tactics, keep escalating the pressure tactics, and none of those individual tactics may work. But in the aggregate, when you put all of them together, you never know when that final straw gets put on the stack that's finally going to cause the bottom to fall out for a terrible project. So that's sort of been our strategy with the UNC coal plant campaign, is just attack them from every conceivable angle. And for sure, you can bet we've got more tricks up our sleeve and more pressure tactics on the way, guaranteed. So I also want to encourage people to keep an open mind and not be attached to what I'm going to call orthodoxy. Our movement, the left in America, has been recycling the same old tactics by and large since the 1960s and 70s. We have a sort of ritualistic way of going about doing things, and we just keep repeating tactics that did work generations ago. But we've been repeating them for generations, and there's a couple of problems with that. One thing, it makes your tactics predictable. For another thing, it also makes it easier to neutralize the tactics that you're using because you're being predictable. But the flip side of that coin is an opportunity. Because as I was saying before, there are a lot of tools that aren't necessarily being used. And when you go ahead and try that tool that's not very popular to be used, you might find that it's a very sharp implement that is quite effective because the opposition is not ready for it. So keep an open mind and don't stay attached to the same old tricks. Try new things. And lastly, be willing to be unpopular in order to win. It's important to understand that there are many people in the movement, many organizations in the movement who want to bring about the right result. They want the environment to be saved. They want a livable future. They just don't want to have to upset anybody in the process to get to that result. And so sometimes it takes somebody coming along like the Center for Biological Diversity who is willing to go ahead and be unpopular and upset people and make the Fish and Wildlife Service unhappy, for example, and upset the apple cart a little bit to get red wolf reintroductions going again. So I just want to encourage folks to sort of break out of some of those old patterns of thinking and rock the boat a little bit and see what happens. You might be pleasantly surprised with the results.
Thanks, Perrin. So we're going to get to some questions that people are asking. First question is, how can our members get more involved in our fights?
Yeah, I think, so Patrick did a good job of talking about sort of the easy entry point of Clicktivism, which, you know, we're always funneling those calls to action to you all. Obviously, there's all the sort of the usual suspects, like donating money and writing letters, making phone calls, showing up to actions. I mean, we do organize street demonstrations. And so when you hear about the center organizing those things, please show up if you're in the area, if you're able to make it to those actions. I think that's really, really helpful. We need to demonstrate that we do have a presence on the street. Look for, you know, one thing that's really helpful to us is we have a lot of members who are really interested in these species. They're engaged on the issues already in their own personal lives. And sometimes you all can bring information and opportunities to us that we don't know about. You know, if you get information from the Fish and Wildlife Service about what's going on with the red wolf population, they're not talking to us unless it's through a Freedom of Information Act request. So, you know, it's great if you can communicate with us directly and let us know what you know on the ground. There's a synergy that can happen there. Different people, different groups using different tactics can have a synergistic effect that can be greater than the sum of its parts. So those are some of my ideas. Patrick, do you have any other thoughts?
I think sort of next level engagement beyond Clicktivism is writing personal notes to elected officials. When they have when we show up with 16,000 signatures in tow, that is one type of powerful statement. When they get a couple dozen handwritten letters or personal emails about an issue, that can be as or more impactful, because these are people, probably voters, who went out of their way to contact an office and raise an issue. So that's kind of next level engagement, is writing those personal notes and making it so that elected officials can't ignore you or us.
Perrin, we have a very specific red wolf question. What about introducing red wolves to other areas like Louisiana or Arkansas? Is there potential there?
Excellent question. The Center for Biological Diversity has spearheaded the effort around pushing the Fish and Wildlife Service to create new reintroduction sites. We actually identified tens of thousands of acres across the Southeast that would be very suitable habitat primarily in national forests, from Arkansas to Virginia, and everywhere in between. There are tons of places where the red wolves can be reintroduced. There's no reason why that can't be happening right now, except for the agency inertia around trying. And I mentioned that they stopped trying 5 years ago. We finally broke that log jam. Now we need to keep that ball rolling. We released a report that I encourage you to go to biologicaldiversity.org, put red wolf in the search bar, and you will see that report that we produced, which is excellent and has a lot of detailed information about all the locations where red wolves can be reintroduced. Yes, that's a fundamental, absolute must, non-negotiable component of the recovery plan, the recovery program for red wolves going forward. They are not going to thrive and truly recover without that. So thank you for your excellent question.
Someone asked a question about what's important about crayfish or spring snails. Like, how do you organize around obscure species? Patrick, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I think in many cases, obscure species, some little snail that lives nowhere else on Earth but one place, they are important in and of themselves, because all life is valuable, all life has intrinsic value. But usually they're also important because they are a keystone element of an ecosystem. So you can't just protect a spring snail or just protect a crayfish. You have to protect the water, and by protecting that water, you're protecting the whole ecosystem. So Tierra, quite infamously in Nevada, applied for endangered species protection for 42 spring snails across the state at the same time, still causing controversy here 11 years later. You know, by protecting those snails, by the fight for those snails, we protect every spring that those snails live in. So that's dozens and dozens of springs across the state. And then who uses those springs? Well, we have fish, of course. There's migratory birds. There's waterfowl, there's mule deer and pronghorn and elk, our major ungulates. There is a whole suite of life, of desert life, that lives at those springs. And so fighting for those spring snails is really fighting for life itself and the ecosystems that make life possible.
Thanks, Patrick. And to address the specific question about why are crayfish important, we actually get this question all the time about frogs or other species. Well, what good is it to humans? Crayfish is an easy one to answer because they play a really big role in the food web, because they eat dead things in the creek. They eat dead vegetation, other dead animals, and then they're eaten by birds, otters, mammals, raccoons, fish, other animals that people tend to care more about than crayfish. So they play a role in keeping the water cleaner as well. Pretty much every animal is out there doing something for us while we're sleeping, and we don't even know about it. There's a question about our alliances and working with other groups, and we work with tons of other groups all of the time. Sometimes we go solo, but sometimes we work with the groups, and sometimes it takes every single group to fight something like the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, the attempt to gut that. Lots and lots of groups worked on that, and we were one of them, and that was a really big win. Perrin, somebody asked about some examples of the new tricks you were talking about.
Oh, trying new tricks. Well, so I mentioned that the Mountain Valley Pipeline Southgate spur, we defeated the 401 certification at the state level here in North Carolina to allow that pipeline, that frack gas pipeline, to bring all of that nasty, dirty fossil fuel down into our state and threaten all these sensitive aquatic and terrestrial and avian species. And so, you know, we had to learn about the 401 certification process in law school when I was studying to become a lawyer, because I studied the Clean Water Act, and but you know, it really didn't receive any real attention. I mean, I had to read about it. You know, there was like a page maybe or two in my textbook about it, but there wasn't any real attention given to it. And honestly, I have never heard of a win using the 401 certification process. And I personally had never used the 401 certification process to challenge a project. So, you know, we just happen to have, because of the way the 401 process is set up, the state gets a say. And, you know, this is basically a federally regulated project because it crosses from Virginia into North Carolina. So the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission really has the overall jurisdiction over it. But both Virginia and North Carolina get a say in whether or not the waters can be degraded. Well, it's just not very common for the states to actually use this tool to stop something like this from going through. But we had a confluence of a couple of factors. They started building the main line of Mountain Valley Pipeline through West Virginia and Virginia, and they wanted to build Southgate off the southern end of it. Well, in the process, they trashed almost every waterway they crossed. There were just unbelievable, just hundreds of water quality violations in Virginia in particular, tons of fines. They were injunctions. They had to stop construction because they were wrecking the waterways so badly and not following all the protections that they promised they were going to use to protect all the species in the water and everything. So the confluence of the bad behavior of Mountain Valley in building the main line, and us having an administration in North Carolina that was willing to listen to what we had to say and was willing to finally throw down the gauntlet and defend our sensitive aquatic species and our clean water in North Carolina, presented an opportunity that I said, you know what, I think we can potentially win this. And so we tried it. You know, we've got a governor running for re-election here in North Carolina. We've got a head of the DEQ, the Department of Environmental Quality in North Carolina, who I think wants to run for governor when this governor's done. So these are both, you know, natural born politicians who are trying to burnish their environmental credentials. And we said, well, let's see if they want to use Southgate to do that. And sure enough, they denied the permit. So that's an example of using a tool that doesn't get used very often and that I haven't seen used effectively before, that bore fruit when we went ahead and pulled it out and gave it a try.
Thanks, Perrin. Somebody asked about the call for massive public outcry and asked if signing petitions actually makes a difference. Patrick, you want to take that one?
Yeah, it absolutely does. It's not a victory yet, although we're very close. We've been fighting a proposed military expansion into Desert National Wildlife Refuge, the largest wildlife refuge in the lower 48, which protects bighorn sheep and desert tortoise, among many other creatures. It's the size of Delaware. This wildlife refuge is craved by the military for a bombing range. And we rounded up 32,000 signatures opposed to it early on in the campaign, which is a huge number for the state of Nevada. You're talking about 1% of the population of this state wrote in a letter saying they oppose this expansion, which is incredible. And that was so critical toward rallying our elected officials onto our side. Being able to show up and, we do a big theatrical thing. We bring boxes full of petitions, I know it's all electronic these days, but there's still power in showing up with boxes full of signed petitions, or the figurative version thereof, to be able to say, look, this isn't just the cutting edge environmentalists pushing this agenda. This is mainstream. This has support from the people. And that is a tremendously compelling thing. So again, it can seem like, oh, you just click a few times and it disappears into the ether and you don't know what happens on the back end. But this can be a critical campaign tactic for our activists. You're on mute, Tiara.
I'm on mute. I'll just second what Patrick said and say that even in federal documents, when federal agencies issue their decisions on projects, they often cite how many people wrote in support of the project or the listing of the species. So it does make a difference. Perrin, there's a specific question for you about how to get more people in North Carolina aware of the plight of red wolves and other species.
Well, if you're asking how you can help more people in North Carolina be aware of red wolves, then I would encourage, a lot of people are very social media savvy these days. And so obviously sharing our red wolf content through social media is one way to spread the word. But I would really encourage you to write letters to the editor about it and express your concerns, tell the story of the species, explain the plight of the dire nature of the situation for the wild population and how much help is needed. Talk about how it's the government's job to ensure that the species not only survives but recovers in the wild, and yet they have been, sleeping on that job for way too long. I think that kind of pressure coming from everyday people on the ground, you can always write a letter to the editor, and it's actually a really good way. There are a lot of people who pay attention to those letters to the editor. It's a good way to raise the profile of the issue. Also, who pays attention to the letters to the editor is the editor of the newspaper. And, if we want to get coverage in a newspaper, to get major newspapers to cover the story of the red wolf, and they have people consistently writing letters to the editor, they're going to take it more seriously that their readers are interested in the issue. So yes, I think you can elevate the profile yourself, in addition to the work that the center does all the time whenever we can to try to get this out into the media, into the public eye, on our website, out in press releases, etc. So please amplify our content and please create your own original content as well.
So we've only got a minute left, but someone asked about further resources for fighting projects. Do either one of you have a source or tips on how someone can get involved in the EIS process?
Let's say talk to your local activists. Every state in the country, whether there's the center or other organizations, there are people on the ground fighting for the environment. And generally, the more help we have, the better off we are. So, don't be afraid to reach out. Figure out who's active in your area. Read the newspaper, read the articles about the issues, see who's quoted, see who's fighting, and reach out and see how you can plug in. Because, usually activists are going to be grateful for the help. And so, don't be afraid to pick up the phone, so to speak. Send an email.
And you can join our activist network on our website at savelifeonearth.org, or go to our regular website, biologicaldiversity.org, action, and sign up. We have an action toolkit on there too. Well, thank you, Patrick and Perrin, for joining us tonight. We're out of time. Thank you at home, and to Karina, who's behind the scenes. She's actually really good at tech. Next week, we're not going to have a speaker series webinar because we're having a food justice film festival, and it is going to be amazing. It runs from the 24th to the 27th, and you can watch a new food justice film festival every day. You're going to get an email right now asking you to take action to help protect 30% of the US by 2030. So please do that. And we'll be on Slack tomorrow from 12 to 1 Pacific if you want to continue this conversation. So thanks everybody, and I'll see you in 2 weeks. Bye.